Well, welcome to a glorious April day, and today we're in the fabulous East Lancashire Pennines, and this morning we've been doing part and parcel of the Weavers' Uprising. Me and Julian have done a bit of a reenactment. We didn't have long to learn it, so I'm going to put it on at the end of this video, but you'll see we've done it with scripts, but still I hope you enjoy it. Now, what am I doing here? It's in one of my favourite places, a place I used to hang about a lot as a kid. Well, not hang about, we used to walk an awful lot. We're up near Cloudbridge Res. I've got Gambleside Colliery in front of me. Behind us, we've got Hamilton Hill, where Cupola Colliery used to be. New Laith, now think on, New Laith. I'm going to mention New Laith later, and Goodshire Hill. And this afternoon, we're going to be looking into a fabulous story of quite a forgotten celebrity, for want of a better word, a man that made his impression on this area and was also involved in the Weavers' Uprising. And I'm going to be going back to my childhood in the fact that we're going to be rooting round old farm remains. Welcome to Dunnockshaw and Cloudbridge. Well, behind me, we've got the village of Gambleside. Can you see where those trees are there? And it's an ancient village, really. It really is. And it's sat not quite on three parishes, but near the boundary of three parishes. Obviously, Gambleside itself is in the old higher booths. We're not far from the Cliviger parish border. And obviously, the reservoir, if you look on all maps, Cloudbridge Res used to be part of Hapton. Now, contrary to popular belief, the village wasn't full of colliers, it wasn't full of pitmen. You can see just in the bottom here, hopefully, where the old pumping pit was, which dates after 1861. And the village, we can trace it back a long time, and a lot of quite influential families can trace a history back there. We've seen the Hargreaves, as we've mentioned, the Burnley Hargreaves coal owners having relations there, and it's the home of the Ormrods mostly. A lot of Ormrods in Cliviger, at Ormrod itself, and also at the village. Now then, the area around here now always has been gorgeous, but when I was a kid, it was slightly different. It was a bit more sort of wildish. We'd come over here and play as kids in the mid-70s up to the 80s, when we kind of moved on a bit, got girlfriends and one thing and another, but you could spend all day over here then and not meet a soul. And now it's got all sorts of cycle paths and walkways. It's a lovely place to come, and the place has really been open to the public. The cycle paths, you can go 30-40 miles around the area now and hardly touch a main road at all. And people come from far and wide to enjoy the area, and it's lovely. But back when we were kids, we used to go around scouring a lot of the old farms that you can see knocking about, and we'd make nuclear fallout shelters for the inevitable that was going to come, we thought, in the 1970s. Anyway, let's go and have a look at one farmhouse in particular that has some fantastic history, and history that connects with today's events with the Weavers' Uprising. So, where are we? And what's this pile of stones? Well, we've got the village behind me, and this pile of stones is the remains of Meadowhead farmhouse. And Meadowhead farmhouse really brings together two protagonists from the 1826 uprising. The house itself has got nothing to do with it, but it's two occupants that lived here that on one Wednesday back in 1826 were most probably deadly enemies. We can't prove that 100% on one of them, but we know he was there, or he was part of the uprising, and he lived here. But somebody else also lived here. Who? Well, Meadowhead was actually the family home. The estate was owned by none other than David Whitehead's father. His name escapes me, but David, Peter and Thomas were all born here. Obviously they were part of a much bigger family, but this is where they actually came from. In the 1790s, this is where they lived. This is where they grew up, and this is where they played as kids. And it's interesting, some of the games that they played. David, in his autobiography, talks about them making little water wheels and things, and in the mud and slush, sinking little coal pits. Well, that is really interesting because they must have observed the coal pits to involve them in their play. And they did, because there was pits here. Not the Gambleside colliery that we think of today. It's a much older one, situated closer towards Goodshire village and Hart Hill. But this is where the mill owners, David, Peter and Thomas, took the first early breaths and used to play out. And what a fantastic outlook they had looking across the valley. There we've got Hambledon Hill, and if you look near the base of Hambledon Hill, we've got a farm called New Laith. That's not the original New Laith, but I want you to bear that New Laith in mind. Now, David's father died when he was comparatively young, and they had to give up the estate. And they moved, I think they moved to Brockclough in Whitewell Bottom from here. Now, bearing in mind, the mum made her living then as a handloom weaver. She carried on and looked after the family. And it looks like, when you read his autobiography, David had a bit of a unsettled kind of upbringing into his teens and his manhood. He got various apprenticeships that didn't last at all, and sometimes he came home in ignoble sort of circumstances, accused of various things. So he was quite troubled, and in truth I think he was an honest kind of lad, really. People just didn't seem to take to him very much, and his mum seems to have wanted him out of the way on many occasions. She just wanted to get on with her weaving and get him out and a trade learned. And like a bad penny, he kept coming home. But one thing you learn about the Whiteheads, or what I picked up when I went through the autobiography, was how close the three brothers were, of David, Thomas and Peter. They stuck together, and that is where a lot of their strength came from. If people sort of briefed against them, they wouldn't take it in. They believed in each other more than they believed what turned out mostly to be lies against them. Now, another thing in their early life that had a great impact on them, again, came from the mum. She had heard John Wesley preach, and she took to Wesley in a great way. And in some ways, she kept her family away from others. And if you look at Meadowhead, we're up here on the bank. We're kind of away from the main village. And David does say how, as a family, they were quite insular and kept away from all the wrong uns that live round about. So that is where we placed David Whitehead up at Meadowhead. I never knew these things until comparatively recent. So where does the other person come in to Meadowhead? Well, I've just mentioned New Laith Farm across, and we have to go back to 1805 thereabouts, when a man called James Maden was born. Well, you can see Meadowhead back down there. Now then, we've got some new information, so this has been put on top, because we've got to get things right, haven't we? We don't want things half-baked. There's actually two Meadowhead farms, of course. And we've got some information this week as to say that James Maden actually lived on the higher farm. So we want to get it right, as we said. It is Whiteheads that own the bottom farm, and there was also two cottages involved with it as well. This is where I'm at now. So what is this about? Well, John Whitehead, David Whitehead's grandfather, was born 1672. Said he come from Meadowhead, or he lived at Meadowhead, Gambleside, and he was married to Anne Ormrod of Gambleside. So the roots were here in Gambleside village. Now, John Whitehead Jr., David's father, was born 1732, and again Meadowhead. And originally he married Peggy Nuttall. And Nuttall again is another local name. We know quite a lot of Nuttalls out of Gretclough. Not saying that's really where she was from, but a lot of Nuttalls in this area. And they had a lot of children together, 4 of which died in infancy, but Peggy died early as well. She was no age really when she died. And then John married Anne Blakey, and she was going on for 30 years his junior. And again, they had lots of children who, Thomas, David and Peter were part of that family, and David was born in 1790 and lived here at Meadowhead. Now, we found, well, Shane's come across some documents. Thanks to Shane Harden, he's really helped with this. This, even though it's like it says Rossendale Collieries, it's the effort is between quite a lot of us who join in and freely share information and learn together, really. And I think that's the key to history, is learning together and sharing information, putting the jigsaws together and helping each other. That's how we get some places. And yeah, not being frightened to explore new avenues as well. So looking off what we know, one of the documents, the surrender documents, because John Whitehead died in 1802, and this property was leased. You know, they had the lease off the Duke of Buccleuch, and that lease had to be surrendered. And when it talks on the lease, it talks about David Whitehead's under-tenants as well. So that, if you lease some land back in the day, I know when I look at Bill's archive, Bill Lloyd's archive, you could lease land, have a farm, and then you could build buildings on that and sublet. You've got your under-tenants that you're leasing out to. Now there's 2 cottages on the 1844 Ordnance Survey map that's just higher up than Meadowhead. And I didn't sort of notice, but when I look at the later edition of the map, they're not on. They're not on at all. And they're on the early census, although it doesn't name them. It just says, you look at Meadowhead and it looks like there's 4 different tenants. But this is where I'm sat now. I'm sat on one of the cottages, and I am sort of surmising, rightly or wrongly, that these are to do with Lower Meadowhead, where the Whiteheads lived. So he would have had under-tenants here. And yeah, so this is the estate that he surrendered. So John Whitehead is sort of classed as a yeoman, a farmer, if you will, you know what I mean? Obviously not a gentleman, but they owned land or possessed land, copyhold land or tenanted land. They were not landowners as such, but they held land. Let's look the proper definition for yeoman up, shall we? So he's classed as a yeoman. Now, Anne, his widow, when you read David Whitehead's diaries, she was a weaver, a handloom weaver. And when they left here, he died in 1802. And according to what we've found out so far, and there is a little bit more, John's executors were Nicholas Olstead of Burnley, a gentleman, and John Greenwood of Swallowshore, which is going over the water end. He was also a yeoman. They were executors of of John's will. And it looks like the farm was then passed on to John Priestley of Edge. Well, Edge, it can be a little bit confusing, but Edge is more back down towards Badgercourt down there. There's a couple of different Edge farms, but that's where it was. It looks like the farm passed to him. We'll look at the lease, or the surrender document, in a little bit more detail and tell you. But in part of his will, that I've only read in part so far, he classed his sons of coming of age when they were aged 12, really. And his wife could benefit off the estate and could benefit off the estate as long as she didn't get married again. If she did get married, well, she was on her own. I suppose that was to stop somebody marrying her for what she had. But it looks like when you read David's diaries that Anne carried on being a handloom weaver. They moved across to Brockclough, Whitewell Bottom, and I'll have to read it again, but it looks to me like they were still handloom weaving from home. Or that's what she was doing, and she kept trying to get David apprenticed out. And when I was going through the census looking for more on James Maden, even in 1851, there was quite a few of these, well, there was 1 or 2 farms up here that still had handloom weavers. They weren't in loom shops, they were handloom weavers, old artisans themselves. So they held on, some of them, till the 1850s at least. So these are the 2 cottages that are attached to Lower Meadowhead. And later on in the 1850s, when we look at the census, it was tenanted by a man named Heap. He seemed to have it for quite a long time. And these cottages seemed to be inhabited then, but then they fell into disuse and they totally disappeared. So let's have a wander now up to Higher Meadowhead, where James Maden, it appears off another document we found, did actually live. I think after coming all this way, it's only right to sit and have a bit of bait and dwell on a truly remarkable man where he lived. James's dad was called John, and the Madens is a difficult family to research, obviously, because there's that many of them in the area, and I haven't found out the name of James's mum. But like David Whitehead's mother, she was influential in a religious way. Now, even though James's dad, John, wasn't religious, he didn't practice any religion, it was said of him that he was one of the kindest, warmest men about. And if he'd been the deepest devotional guy, he couldn't have been any nicer than he actually was. But his mother, well, she was a particular Baptist. And that is interesting, coming from New Laith. Because, as I've talked about in another video, the Hudson family of New Laith were the driving forces behind the particular Baptist movement in this area. And they later built the chapel at Goodshire Fold. So, it could be reasonable to conclude that she and the Hudsons were like in the same sort of group. So James didn't really grow up religious, but his mum taught him to read. And she taught him to read, like most people, out of the Bible. She taught him out of the New Testament. And by the age of 5, he could read. And it was round about this time that he started going across to Goodshire Chapel, where they had a Sunday school. And the Reverend then was John Pilling. Now, Sunday school isn't what we kind of attended back, well, those of us that did go to Sunday school, that were forced to go to Sunday school. Thank you, ma'am. They were actually schools. And John then learned to write there James learned to write as well, because John Pilling established a proper school there to educate the children. And it's interesting round Goodshire Chapel, the amount of education there was, because I believe Tartop they had a bit of a school there, and also further across at Chamber Height, there was a school there at one time. So let's have a quick transport across to Goodshire Chapel and see exactly where the chapel was and where young James attended. Well, this is the village of Goodshire Chapel, where James Maden used to come to worship. He must have been here around about the 1820s, going off some of what he says. And this is a village that I grew up in. It doesn't look like a village now, does it? When I first moved up here as a kid, it'd be 1969, the old village of Goodshire Chapel was still up and standing, and we used to play in all the old houses. And where I'm stood now, these were all houses. In fact, you can see in the walls, the chapel walls, where the old windows were and fireplaces and what have you. And we used to play football on here as kids. It'd be hard pushed to do that now, wouldn't you? So this is Goodshire Chapel, and I used to think that it was called Goodshire Chapel because of the actual Baptist chapel that goes back to the 1760s, but it isn't. It's to do with the church, the C of E church. It was in the 1500s, they built a church there from the chapelry of Whalley. It was like a chapel of ease, if you know what I mean, and that's why the village got called Goodshire Chapel. And basically it's part of the old main highway, the old coach road that came through the village. I've heard it described in the end of the 1800s as a poor man's new church. Well, maybe not. But this is where James Maden first came to hear his sermons, and he met his wife. And according to Moses Heap, this village used to be absolutely bustling on a Sunday. It was bustling anyway. It was a very busy village, but especially on Sunday when people came from far and wide to the chapel. It's got big links, obviously, with Lum, and the Dean Layrocks, the music and everything, the Larks of Dean, massive musical heritage around here. In fact, it's probably got the village has a lot more to do with Lum and that than it does with Rossendale. When you go back to the old days, people were travelling up and over the tops more than they were travelling down the valleys. In fact, when I first got married and we went to live up Watter, up Culvert, Gravy Weir, and some of the houses were still back to backs. And I remember calling on this old lady near the end of the road for whatever reason, and she said, "And where does that come from?" I said, "I come from Goodshire, from up Crawshire Booth." "Oh, aye," she says, "yeah, I've been there once. I think about 1956. So that connection had got lost. Any road, people used to come to the village on Sunday and they'd stay. They wouldn't just do one service, according to Moses, they'd do at least two. And they'd get something to eat in the village. The pubs would have a stew on or a broth. So very, very different times. And even when we were kids, the chapel were in quite a lot of disrepair, and we used to play about in the graveyard and what have you, and we used to warn each other that there was a ghost there. It was a local legend, the ghost of Maria the Nun, and we'd frighten each other. I think sometimes we even believed our own tales. But even then, there was just one service a year that used to go on in the gardens, and I remember me and a friend, Neil Crossland, going to it once with the old lady that lived across the road from us. So anyway, in the 70s, it was really a brilliant place to grow up. And this takes us back, another of the haunts of James Maden, and where he kind of found his spirituality and then lost it and battled with himself. Now then, I dare say back then there was a lot of hellfire and brimstone type preachers. And it bothered James a lot because he kind of wanted to be religious, but the flesh was kind of weak and he kept putting it off, if you know what I mean. But any road, his frequent trips to Goodshire brought him in contact with what he called the sweetest singer in the choir at the Baptist Chapel, Charlotte Ashworth, who was the orphan daughter of one of the orphan niece of one of the deacons who looked after her. Now then, her and James got married, and James said he was about 21 when he married her. Now then, if he was born round about 1805, I haven't got an exact date, and he was 21, that's going to put us round about 1826, isn't it? So was he married at the time of the Weavers' Uprising? And at this time, he was a handloom weaver. So all that we know about his involvement in the uprising comes from his later life and his biography that was written after he died. But obviously it was something he loved to talk about. Now we know he was there. It's quite possible he was at the Chatterton fight. That is what it is called in the memoirs. It is also possible that he was at Peterloo, because it said that one of his favourite subjects, even when he got old, was Peterloo and the Chatterton fight. Now we know after the uprising, after what we call a massacre now, really, there was a lot of recriminations as part of the reenactment. People were fetched out of bed. They wanted to find ringleaders. They wanted to make people pay. Now then, James was affected by this because we don't know where he lived exactly, but he lived in a low cottage. He said a low roof cottage, and he had a scythe, and he kept that scythe in the bedroom every night because he figured if they were going to come for him to fetch him out of bed, well, he was going to mow a few heads off on his way up his wide chimney and away across the fells. So we know he took a very active part in that uprising. But how did he change from that radical sort of activist, if you will, into being a preacher? Well, the answer is slow and gradual. And I don't want to make this video about, well, a religious video, if you know what I mean. It's about a guy and his passion. But what James did, he took that passion from his activism and put it into his religion. And not only his religion, but looking out for people who lived by him, his fellow man, his neighbours. He really was, he wasn't a cardboard cutout. He was a giant of a man in personality, in speech, and also in deed. Now, they'd only been married about a year. In fact, it was just about the time that their first child was being born. Altogether, James and Charlotte had 6 kids. But about a year into the marriage, James got really bad typhus, to the point he nearly died. He was unconscious. He was about done for. In fact, the Reverend Pilling came to visit, and he said to Charlotte, "Charlotte, it's not going to be long before there's a widow lass." And even though James was in a bit of a stupor, he kind of remembers hearing that, and that could have been his sort of clarion call. He rallied after that. Now, we can't go into James's life fully because it'd take us too long. But his journey into the man that he became, one day he walked all the way to Rochdale to hear somebody preach. That's no small journey. And he borrowed threepence to put into the collection. But as he went in through the door, I mean, he walked all the way from somewhere around Goodshire, Crawshaboo the way. As he went in through the door, somebody were on there rattling the collection plate at him and asking for silver. So he gave his threepence, and it really spoilt his day. He just kind of sat there. And that was the trouble with some things. And James wanted to be something different. And he moved around. The family moved around. They moved across to Tottington, and they lived I won't say where they lived, but they ended up at Watter. And in the moving, that's when James got more deep into his beliefs, and he started to learn that he could actually preach. So what brings him back to Gambleside? Well, he had a mate that lived on Cotton Row, and he went to visit him one night. Now, his mate was called Abraham Riley, and he lived the other side of what's now the Res, in Cotton Row. And he went across to visit him one night, and as they were in the house, two women, it says, of low repute, his words, not mine, came dancing and singing down the street, a regular occurrence in Cloudbridge on a Saturday night, and they were singing and playing tambourines. And he rode a preacher was coming down the road, and he knelt down in the road and started to pray for these two fallen women. And that kind of got James off and thinking, and James offered to come back and start preaching in Abraham's house. And that really is the beginnings, or the foundations that were laid of them moving to Gambleside. So for a start, what they did, they rented an old house and they started having meetings there. And they established a school. Remember we talked about the school at Goodshire Baptist? Well, they started a school, and the first time that was opened was the first Sunday in January of 1840, and it were a rough old morning. It was snowing and the wind were blowing, but still, it says, quite a few kids came and they attended that school. So there was a need in the village, a need not just for religion but for education, and James now was starting to fill that. But by this time he was living up at Watter still. He was living over at Water at this particular point. I'll show you where on the map and on the census. And he used to walk across from there every Sunday, and however many times in the week he needed to come here to get the congregation going. Now, we've learned of James that he was a man of passion, a man of power within himself. Now, people like that really need stimulation. So he needs a challenge all the time, and he got to the point where he thought that he'd gone as far as he could go at Gambleside. And then we come to a bit of a story that involves, well, if you've got a preacher that's kind of losing his mojo, what better than a drunken collier that needs saving to put him back on the right track? Now, James had set off from Watter one Sunday morning to walk across the moors to get here, and he was feeling pretty low. It just about, he read his wit's end sort of thing. He'd had enough. And he stopped and sat down in a field. And it's interesting, these old accounts, because we get these old names. And this field I'm thinking which way he must have come across. Did he come across via Constance Cross, or did he come up another way and up Binodlock? I don't know. But anyway, he sat down in this field that was called the Knave's Ark. That's what it was known as. And he just about had enough. In fact, he felt like he could just run away and be done with it. But he dragged himself up and he got himself to the chapel. And what did he see? Well, there sat in the chapel was a very strong, stoutly built guy. But he looked rough. He looked really rough. As James said, he was an ideal specimen of a man from low life, a big drinker. And his name was James Howarth, or as we would say up here, James Howarth. And he was a collier, he had to be, hadn't he, and a cobbler betrayed. And he'd come to the chapel to listen to James. And by the end of the meeting, he'd made his mind up that he wanted to leave his old ways behind. And he went home and he said to his wife, Sarah, he says, I've been across to Gambleside to listen to James Maden. I'm done with drinking. I'm going to be a Christian. And she said, nay, Jemmy, I don't believe thee. It'll not be long afore thou'rt back at thy lass. He said, no, next Sunday I'll be at Gambleside again. And he was, and so was Sarah. And good to his word, He was one of the first to get baptised in this new congregation. Not in the baptismal font, because that hadn't got going yet, but he was one of the first to get baptised. And he himself became a giant of a man, not just in pit work, but also in preaching. He really did change. And not only that, he was a cobbler besides, and he made James Maden one of the best pair of shoes that he'd ever had, because James couldn't afford them on the meagre stipend he was getting as a preacher. Now then, I seem to remember that James Howarth worked in the pits or at Baxenden. I picked that up from somewhere. And one Monday morning, he got to work, and just before he went down pit, he said to all lads, all young drawers more than likely, now then, he says, if you all lads keep a clean mouth and you daren't swear none of you all week, come Saturday, I'm going to give you all a present. And it looks like they all kind of agreed. I don't know if they would have managed the feat or not. Anyway, James was last seen going down the pit, singing at the top of his voice, there is a pure land. Sadly, that day, James was caught in a roof fall and he was killed instantly. Eventually, they left that house and they converted in the village where we stood now in Gambleside village. Believe it or not, how ironic, the old brew house, that became their chapel. For many, many years, and they constructed that outdoor baptism font that's still very important. Well, yeah, it's an important sight to see today. They must have been hardy as anything. And there's talk of crowds, hundreds of people sat on the hillside behind that font while people got baptised. But as you can see behind me, it's this reservoir, then known as Hapton Res, that spelt the death knell for this little chapel in Gambleside, because it meant that people had to take, well, they'd got to take a detour. That was all fields and farms. Well, now they had to make a long walk round to get to the chapel. So what it was decided to do was to build a new one. And they built one, which is still there today, that would have held between 400 and 500 people. And it cost about 800, it cost 800, not about, it cost £800. By this time, James Maden had got his relationship, if you will. He'd become a farmer up at Meadowhead. That's where James is associated with Meadowhead. He was the incumbent farmer. And people said that when they visited the farm, he was just like any other farmer. He'd come in from the fields with his clogs and a spade over his shoulder, and he'd be happy to give anybody his time. So that is our connection. I love it when history comes together like that. They started the services and the chapel opened in 1866. But by 1868, James sadly suffered a paralysis, which was to affect him for the rest of his life. Now, they also started a school there. As we said, the schools were important, but they were getting quite a lot of competition. They were aiming at the mill workers' children, the half-timers and that, but it seems like some people came across from Padiham, the Hapton end, and built another chapel, opened another school in direct competition, and it affected them quite a little bit, to be honest with you. But in 1873, James managed to pay the last £5 off that £800 off the chapel. It was done, it was paid for, and it was theirs. But sadly, in February of 1874, it was particularly cold. And James went out for a walk and he caught bitter cold, and it took to bronchitis. Sadly, James lasted just a week. And on Saturday, the 21st of February, 1874, he passed away peacefully, satisfied with his life and quite content. And he left behind a big legacy. So that's somebody that doesn't really come up into Rossendale history very much, does it? And I hope you've enjoyed his story. And he loved to talk about the things of the past. Even though he was a preacher, he loved talking back about Peterloo. Was he there? He was old enough. He loved talking about what he called the Chatterton fight, where he'd been. He'd taken part in that. He loved to talk about a couple of Jacobins that had got to Rossendale blacksmiths to make pikes for them as they were trying to take over London, go march on London. He was a man of passion. He was a man of right and justice. So two men who stood opposite, why don't you come and have a walk over one day and take a look at it? So we've managed to find now quite a lot more about James and his family. He actually got married in 1825, which was 12 months before the uprising, it was a bad time to get married. There was a massive economic downturn in the textile industry that really affected East Lancashire, and it specifically affected the individuals who were still handloom weaving at home. So not everybody worked in a loom shop. Not everybody worked in a factory. Weaving had gone on. There was a weavers' guild in London in the 1100s. And the first factories didn't come around, well, Arkwright with his water frames. So this is nothing to do with your rank and file and the people that worked in the mills and the people that worked in the loom shops. This is about your independent artisans, and it's not a romantic way of looking at things. These people did exist, and they were suffering. When one way of life changes with progress and goes on to another, people lose their livelihoods, and they don't want to. They like to keep that independence. It's like being self-employed today, which is what I've tried to get across. So that's the history we're looking at of this small group of people who lost their livelihoods. Now, to draw a parallel, we know the mining industry, how its demise has been documented. It's not a true narrative. History is written as a narrative for the sake of it and for people's agendas. But the truth is probably nowhere near what is written. Because there was two different coal industries. There was the big coal industry and the small independent licensed mining industry. And back when I started in 1980, there was about an equal number of pits. There was 200 big pits and a similar number of small independent mines run by independent people who wanted to keep it such. And the demise of that industry isn't catalogued. There was one programme on BBC Two about the small mines in South Wales fighting the electric board to get equal pay for their coal that the British coal mines were getting. And the same was happening here. Billy Clayton suffered the same up at Grime Bridge. It nearly shut the place. But all that history is not documented. It's not looked at. It's not considered. When Kellingley closed, it was the last pit is closing, the last deep mine. That's the finish. Well, I watched the programme. They seemed like a really nice set of lads and you felt so sorry for them. But they weren't the last. There was other people still going, and that's what we're looking into, or I'm looking into. That's my angle. I'm not part of anything. This is a small independent channel. People do help me, but we have freeness of speech on it, and we're really looking into maybe an alternative side of the history, and that's what I want to do. There was a group of strikers walked across from Ashton-under-Lyne. Now, they could have been colliers. I'm not 100% sure. It was 1830, 1831. And they got to round Whitworth and they went to the Hog's Egg colliery that was owned by the Buxton family. Now, the Buxtons also owned a mill, cotton mill. And they were nephews of John Lord of Cowm, who left everything in his will to the Buxton family. Now, you're not going to find much in Rossendale local history that's written about John Lord of Cowm, but I'm telling you, he's one of our founding fathers is the wrong word, but he did have a lot to do with setting up industry, certainly around the Whitworth and Grieve area at the beginning of the 1800s, and certainly into coal mining as well. But he's not in local history, so people are finding things out about people that have long been forgotten. And in those days, a lot of the pits had a coal pit house. It sounds like a big barn where the entrance was and what have you. And as they approached, the colliers, or those on the surface, shut the doors and barred them, a little bit like they were barring a mill gate. Now, as these strikers had gone through the village, obviously Buxton had been alerted, and what he did, he loused all the men out the mill and sent them up to the pit. And obviously, when up at the pit, those on the pit top were shouting all the colliers to come out, and a right pitched battle went on up at Buxton's Hog's Egg colliery there, a proper pitched battle. And the authorities, the police, whatever they were summoned, but they just stood and watched and waited. Their idea was to pick up the dead and the wounded. They weren't getting involved in that. But can you see how some people had a political cause, walked all the way from Ashton-under-Lyne to try and turn a pit out, and yet the owners, the people that worked in the mill and the people that worked in the pit had a vested interest in that industry and that particular location and fought like mad to preserve it, which is what we've got with the uprising. So the question to ask is, why did some people fight for the owners, do everything they could with all conscience, and why did some do what looks like a mindless act in smashing things? That's how history portrays it, and it's just not the case. Anyway, I hope that you've enjoyed this little portrayal of two people that didn't live in the same house, as it turns out. They were next door neighbours, so to speak, although with a few decades in between the two of them. But two men that really stamped the mark on Rossendale history, certainly the Whiteheads and the mills that they had, and a lesser known man, James Maden. But he stamped his mark on this area, although it's largely forgotten, sadly. He had a massive effect on people. So, like I said, we're just a small independent YouTube channel that's grabbing hold of the technology, and the platform's available now. It's like when the new Power Looms came in, those that grabbed hold of the new technology and ran with it ended up being the success, didn't they? So that's what we're doing. We're just a small independent channel. We make no money out of anything. We put money and time into it, and we're just trying to bring a bit of happiness and bring a bit of left of field history into people's homes and lives. So I hope you've really enjoyed watching this as much as I've enjoyed making it.
Thanks.
Right. Well, welcome. The first thing you've got to think about, have a good imagination, that we had national health glasses back in 1826. And we're a bit tight on this, that's why we've still got the scripts in our hands. We do apologise. Now the premise, obviously, is these aren't actual events that happened, but they're based on events and speeches that were made to give people a little bit more of an idea of context back in 1826 and the aftermath. So we're in David Whitehead, the mill owner's office.
This is after the event.
This is after Chadderton.
Yeah.
We can't say how long after, not too long after, but things are relatively back to normal in inverted commas. And we've got in the office a weaver who David believes is one of his employees, but he hasn't been seen for quite a while. But also in the room is Mr. Whitehead's clerk, Mr. Duckworth, and he's taking minutes of everything. Now, obviously Mr. Duckworth doesn't exist, so you've got to just use your imagination. Mum, what's to do with it? That's been absent from the work there. Where's the bin? There's fines for such, and some had had thee jailed for interrupting this, our means. Now then, thou's got good fortune to be put in place here at our mill, like many. So don't be a fool, and don't spit on the oats.
I did not sleep in mine own bed.
That's a slip down the cellar bit, looks.
In the pit.
How long?
I walked across the mippings.
Now then, stepping stones. Now, think of this speech. I have to tell somebody here what that says, and there's them that don't know what hippings are. Now then, where's Pit? And then go on to tell us about these stepping stones.
I went to Betty Upton's across the river.
Well, it's not Elizabeth in Harrogate that they're talking about, is it? Aye, I've known a few Bettys in my time, but who? And where's Pit that has been concealing this end there?
No, there's no mine can hide facts.
You give me no work.
I worked at Pleasant Street once, where no mill of yourn. Mary Simpson, though not, she bled to death from that wound.
Mr. Duckworth, as he says, just exactly as he says. You've got a nerve. Now, I've plenty of soldiers disguised around my mill should I want, but we'll leave that, Mr. Duckworth. So, you were thrown out of work because my loom's been smashed. Well, we're getting on new now. And we know the cause, don't we? Yes, a great number were wounded at Atkinson's, a mob. And it called for His Majesty's government, yes, to keep adequate force in this populous manufacturing town of ours. And them that lost their lives at mob, well, they're recorded as unlawful. We held a private inquest where such things are noted down.
Unlawful killing. She had no part in it, Mary.
Do you know this woman?
I wondered, could we tell a soldier that he did a crime and now he's far away?
Your speech, this speech of yours, who's lit the touch paper, lad? I'm weary of these words and falling shadows. Now, even though now we're plentiful back in our sheds, that mob picked up stones and it were met with fire.
The soldiers are on our side.
Have you reflected on your folly? As much as I have. And yet I made all your and those living round here make good damages done. And what damages are there in thy mouthings, eh? That's no benefit for paying for their own education. My brothers. Yeah, my brothers and all. They wanted soldiers, they sent for them too.
And all the wounded, oh, if I'd a will into bodies, brothers, sisters and family.
Take your time, take your time.
For a bullet in the back, another weaver that ran away.
Right, write that down, Mr. Duckworth. A bullet in the back. What time, my lad?
I've no recall of time, I am of no time now or place. I've had no rest, no help to work for me head, no means.
Well, a poor ass, a mad ass, a traffic street to get the clean. Come on, it's Anno Domini. Change the words. Now, think on.
I'm early to grave, I can't. They can say at home he's just popped out.
Popped out? Jesus did, he went to hell, he was resurrected in 3 days.
I walked to Chatterton, see where my brothers were. That's me absence. None have heard us or took heed. Them's deed for that. When we go into a dark and cold, which thee might think late, and they prosper. They got new looms, didn't they? And good trade nigh. So it were the end of our hopes in days. No salvation. Life of suffering. Life of Job. Yielding to the dark and the cold. This valley that were good and goud and once will get black with choking fumes, and they shall think it an empire. There were woodland, forest creatures and slope with bluebells. We had songing for the days we marched, we saw them, that we were mighty new. I said to my fellow, you are mighty, lad. Breathe that in. Liberty. Take care of what they got and for what price that was paid.
Sit thee down. Take that cheer figure. Give him some water, or give him a friend. I've told thee about the rantings. You'll be finished, man. There's been red riot attack once. Does they need a fresh blast? That were a Wednesday, a while ago. Thank the Lord it were a while ago and all. Trade's been fair since. Now, that detachment, it were forced to fire. We waved our handkerchiefs and waved our hats to give you a bit of meaning. Go on, visit graves. You're beyond a shilling fine there, lad, well beyond. We went for troops, we went for cavalry. It were rebellion, no but rebellion and mischief. And we need them mischiefs fetched out of the beds and face justice. We need this crushed and smashed. Now then, my house, up in Hill Hall, it were visited by a special arrangement. In the greatest confidence, admit that, Mr. Duckworth. A plot to come and burn down my mill, and then take my own life. You recall, Mr. Watkins, Mr. Duckworth? Omit that, don't put that. This man utters perjuries. He's not learned, he's not listened, and I pay him. Oh, goodness me, I'm more the bloody fool. Give me thy shilling. And now then, what's thy name?
Roll up, you soft devil ears and burn your looms! The name! Can't we, Larry?
Georg.
Thomas Emmett!
Thomas Emmett, he's bound for Australia and transported.
Richard Lund!
Look at graveyard at St James, Mr. Duckworth, because that's no good neither.
We'll get up for a pie in Rossendale town!
Sit down.
Thank you.
Again? Come on, answer. Now then, are you plotting? Are there others? Do you know of a secret path, an escape from an house? No? Write that. And call the constable. The plague, it's entered, and it's happening here. Show a little bit of the aftermath really, and the mill owners and their attitude and how everything was stamped down upon, to say the least, you know. So these things aren't actual events, it's just to give you a bit of a flavour.
Brilliant, well